the creative journey. It's easy to get lost, but don't worry, you'll lift off. Sometimes you just need a creative pep talk.
Hey, you're listening to Creative Pep Talk, a weekly podcast companion for your creative journey. I'm your host, Andy J. Pizza. I'm a New York Times bestselling author and illustrator. And this show is just everything I'm learning about building and maintaining a thriving creative practice. Let's get into it. We all know that doing something substantial with your creativity requires some level of consistency. And it's why on this show, we talk a lot about the idea of creativity as a practice or a habit. The problem is that if you're a creative person, it's likely that you're the type of brain that finds it difficult to form habits, to do things consistently. This is this deep tension that happens for lots of creators where they know that they're super creative and they know that they have to have a habit of creativity to do the things that they want to do. And yet those two things, doing new things constantly, which is creativity, versus doing things routinely, which is the habit, are almost at odds with each other. So there's almost a contradiction within this idea of creative practice. And I know firsthand because for me, it's really, really difficult to make something into what seems like a habit. In fact, a lot of folks in the ADHD community would say that people like me aren't able to truly have what neurotypicals have when they have a habit, because nothing is done automatically. Everything costs a type of willpower energy that is limited. And so for me, this conundrum, this problem of knowing I'm creative and I want to do something with it, and I find it really difficult to be consistent or form habits, this has been a huge challenge in my creative practice and in my creative journey. And the way that I have shifted my thinking is away from habits, like forming these behaviors that become automatic, and into thinking of creativity as a discipline and figuring out what are the disciplines that I am committed to and passionate about and are flexible enough to contain my creativity. And the reason I'm talking about this today is because in this episode, I am going to turn the tables, or they're going to be turned on me, and I'm going to be interviewed for a special episode for the 10-year anniversary of this podcast. So we've been doing Creative Pep Talk for 10 years. And so we're going to do a couple episodes, a few here and there sprinkled in, that celebrate this and maybe even glean some of the things that I have learned from doing a project of this size for this many years. The first and foremost being how to have that level of consistency. We've almost had a new episode every week for 10 years. And as a creative person, as an ADHD person, that is a challenge all on its own. And this episode gets into some of the stuff around podcasting, some of the reasons why this was the right creative discipline for me to be able to consistently show up. And I was lucky enough to have Katherine May, writer Katherine May, that we had on just a few episodes ago, volunteer to do the interview for this episode. And as a major fan of her work, I was just blown away and I couldn't even believe my luck. And then the episode and the questions that she brought were just phenomenal. I got moved and I was feeling the right level of vulnerability hangover after this episode, where I feel like I shared enough to feel like, man, I'm kind of really putting myself out there. But not too much to where I felt like, oh, I don't know if I want to share this. It just feels like a behind the scenes on making this show, on my personal life and my approach to this creative discipline. So we talk about podcasting. We also talk about neurodivergence and how I've built my creative practice around the type of person that I am, which is what has been at the heart of this show since the very beginning. Since the very beginning, this show has been about what do you do when the paths that are in front of you are not built for you? How do you carve out your own unique path and take a creative approach to building your existence? And so I'm going to talk about how I've done this, why things like podcasting suit me, what I've learned about podcasting and having a discipline that you can show up for 10 years. And I'm going to get personal into some of my journey. So if you're new to the show, this is a great place to start because it will really give you an introduction to what this is all about, where it comes from, what it aims to do. And if you're a longtime listener, I think there's stuff on this episode that you've never heard and stuff you might have been curious about. So I'll let you get into it. Massive thanks to Katherine May for taking the time to do this. I don't even know why I'm so lucky to have her do this. She's so thoughtful and intentional, and her questions were just perfect for a 10-year kind of summary and deep dive, and everything kind of comes full circle at the end. I'll be back at the very end of this episode to share with you a creative call to adventure, a CTA, on how to know what kind of creative discipline you should pursue. And I'm calling that channel your overflow. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means and how to do it at the end so that you can maybe have a marker like a decade plus of doing a similar creative discipline yourself, because it is such a great experience. It feels very satisfying. And it was the type of creative work that really worked on me, and it changed who I was. So I'll let you get into the conversation. I hope you love this episode, and I'll be back at the end. Thanks so much for doing this again.
Well, I'm really excited. Thank you for having me.
Me too.
And it's a huge responsibility, and I'm really excited. And I just worry that this is going to be the episode that your listeners hate the most ever, because it's like, who's this woman taking over?
They're not going to think that. I can guarantee you. I had so many people, when you were on, so many people were like, Katherine May's on the show. Oh my
gosh. It's great.
So I think they will not be thinking that.
Well, I'll try not to screw it up. But
Okay.
what I want to start by asking you, because this is like, we're marking two really big events in one, in a way, aren't we? We're marking reaching more or less 500 episodes.
Yeah.
And 10 years. Like, what a collision of amazingly auspicious things that is.
Yeah.
How do you feel about that?
I feel great about it. I think that by the time I started doing the show, it was getting used to a collection of disciplines. I'm ADHD, and so I think my relationship to discipline is fraught and just very difficult, and getting myself to do the work is the hardest work. To me, that's probably the main thing. Is I'm just glad that I figured out a way to have a regular creative practice.
Yeah.
Just being able to produce something. And most of that time I was also making episode art with it. And then I'm also, everybody has complex feelings about their work. I definitely have complex feelings about the show, but I mostly feel good about it. And even when I go back, which I don't hardly ever do, but I had recently to the early episodes, I realized like, oh, I was talking about the exact same things with just, I didn't have as much language for it.
Sure.
So yeah, it feels really good. And, I think this year hitting the 10-year mark, I felt like I was like, should I keep doing this? are like, is this the time to stop? But then now at the end of the year, I'm like, I feel really refreshed. And I feel like, I think this is just something I do, you know?
I think that's amazing. I mean, I'm a quitter. and
Me too. I am
and,
too.
well, and I often blame this on my neurodivergence,
Mm.
but clearly that's not true, because I find that I burn through an idea. Like I'll go passionately into it, and then it's spent. And
Mhm.
I'm always really comfortable walking away. But you have, I mean, it's remarkably consistent. I was listening, I was like sampling through the history of it
Yeah.
before this.
Yeah.
And as you say, you have been circling some really common concerns for a decade, for a whole decade, and you're still
Yeah.
doing it, which is amazing. And I think what ties it all together is this sense of generosity towards the creative community that receive it.
Yeah. Thanks.
Is that I wonder if that's your motivation, really, to share what you know, because it's so hard earned?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because when I started, I was definitely maybe, I don't want to say, maybe just less socially aware. You know, I was in my late 20s at the time. So I feel like I was just not aware. I didn't fully understand yet why people don't like advice. It's
That's
so
on them.
obvious.
That's on them.
It's so obvious, but I didn't know that. And mainly because I'm like, growing up, my dad would tell me, and it was really kind of a diss on my older brother, of like, Andy's really teachable. Like he's teachable. And I think that is true of me, is that I actually like being given advice, which is also, I think, probably not normal.
Yeah.
And so it took me a long time to realize, like, oh, probably about halfway through the run of the show, I realized, like, oh, I started to really understand why is this a sensitive subject? What does it say about me that I have things to share that I feel like maybe people would benefit from? And all of the, you know, therapy around just ego and all of that stuff. Cause I also am really grossed out by ego. And so anyway, I feel like the generosity component, I do think that's the through line, because when I don't even think I'm especially generous. I think I'm literally just very selfish in that it feels so good to, I mean, I think we're just wired to help people. We want, or to be social. And any breakthroughs I had in my illustration practice, the first ones I had, I wanted to tell my friends back home, hey, you can email blogs. Hey, you can, like, I'm like doing this stuff and it's really cool. Like, and I just instantly wanted to tell people, because, I have so many creative people that, and a lot of people I knew growing up that I thought, oh, you're so much more talented than I am. And you're struggling so bad. And just, if you're neurodivergent or creative, and that huge circle Venn diagram that is, a lot of the times, you know, the world is just not set up for you to thrive. And you have a creative perspective just by the nature of having a different perspective. And I think the whole thing is driven by, anything that seems to be helping me, I want to turn around and tell
I'm going to
people
talk about it.
Yeah.
That makes loads of sense to me. I mean, I think the world that we both work in, I mean, it's quite different, but it's really similar.
Sure.
And you go, if you're anything like me, you go on these kind of geeky deep dives to figure out how to do things, you know, like I need to know how to build a website now. So I'm going to basically train in that.
Yeah.
Or I need to make a podcast. And so I'm going to learn how to edit sound, you know, and then there's the whole marketing thing behind it. Like, how do you get people to know who you are and where you are? How do you communicate that? Like, that's a life's work to figure that out. And for some people, it's their main job. And we do all of it on the side. And I feel like it just spills out of you. You want to say, okay, look, I've worked this out, guys. Like, here it is. Like, this is what we do.
100%. And I just want to give people shortcuts on it too. I'm like, this took me, I had to read 5 books and, you know, struggle and make so many mistakes. And now I know, if I just would have known that little thing before I started, it would have been not such a headache. So I think I am driven to just want to share, mainly because I just think it's so hard to be a creative type person. Just everything's hard.
It is.
Yeah.
It's really hard.
And, the other thing I was going to say was where you were saying, like, to have this consistency, to me, it feels like, it feels probably akin to someone writing or someone,
Yeah.
like, it doesn't feel like, because to me, even though a lot of the topics run through, there were definitely like, oh, these 3 years I was obsessed with Jungian dream interpretation. These 3
Right.
years, and it's filtering into everything I'm doing. So I can kind of reinvent it as it goes in a way that feels still interesting.
Yeah. I mean, I find with a lot of the things I do that are outside of my writing, they support it because they actually help me to have a kind of floodplain that all the extra ideas can flow onto. And I really need that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes tons of sense.
So
Yeah.
take me back to right at the beginning, because I think the big question for you and me, it looms in my mind, like, why do we do this? Why
Yeah.
did you start a podcast? What were your hopes and dreams about it? Like, who were you? Paint us that little picture.
Yeah. So, one thing every time I get into any topic about why I do something, I realized for a long time that I was making an assumption about what people knew. So usually when I would say, this is why I did a thing, that was usually like the second or third reason, because I think I made a deal with myself pretty early on. Just realize, before I even knew I was ADHD, I knew people like me have a really hard time doing stuff they don't want to do. Like they have to, like, that is really essential. And I realized, like, I can do stuff I don't want to do, but it's a limited supply. I don't have tons of energy for that. So I realized that sometimes when I get into the details of why I did something, I'm missing the part that's the most true, which is I really wanted to do it. I wanted to do it. And the reason, and my whole self wanted to do it. And I knew that. So I knew that my ego wanted to do it. And that I had like, oh, this is like a strategy. Like, I want to, like, there's good reasons why, for my career, this is a good move. But then I knew also the deeper self wanted to do it. Like, I think this feels like meaningful and purposeful, and I feel uniquely suited to do this. And so that on the first level, I just knew I wanted to do it.
Yeah.
And then on the second level, I had a couple experiences. I think there was two things going on. I'd had a couple experiences doing some talks that were more like storytelling.
Right.
They weren't like portfolio talks. They were just like, I want to talk about a point and use metaphor and analogy and stuff like that. And I'd had such a powerful experience doing that initially I was like, I don't even know if I want to be an illustrator anymore. I was already an illustrator.
Oh, interesting.
I was already doing client illustration, and that was my career. I'd already gone full-time doing that for a couple years by the time I started the show. But when I started doing these storytelling talks, I just had like one or two little opportunities. I thought, this is what I'm obsessed with: analogy and metaphor and story, and then also the performative side of it. And it wasn't until a couple of years later that I heard, I don't know if it was a TED Talk or something, but the person was like, I've got a story to tell you to kind of bring to life what I'm talking about. Here's my illustration. And I was like, they're the same thing. And then it actually really made me a better illustrator, because I started seeing my illustration as not drawing, but writing with pictures. And so anyway, the reason I wanted to do it was I had these experiences. I wanted to have more of those. I wanted that to be a part of what I did. And I thought, I'm going to create 100 episodes, and it's going to be like 100 episode portfolio of talks. And then people will know that that's something I do and want to do. And
I love that idea.
Yeah.
I've never thought of it like that.
Yeah. And I would already, like, I'd already taken that approach on a bunch of different other things. So, editorial illustration, I'd already written a blog for several years and illustrated it, so people knew that I illustrated articles and, that kind of thing. And so I'd done that a couple times. And then the other thing is, which I don't think I gave enough credit to this until later. Now that I have a lot of disconnect from it, I feel comfortable saying this, but I also was really surrounded by church culture in the Midwest. And I didn't grow up in an overly religious household, but I did have a period of time, my late teens, early 20s, that were a pretty religious experience.
Yeah.
And I got really, really obsessed. It's so obvious now, but I got really obsessed with people that were incredible at sermons. And the art of the sermon.
Oratory is kind of coming
and storytelling
through.
and analogy and metaphor. And my relationship to all that stuff has dramatically changed. But I think that was a piece of it that wasn't really obvious to me at the time of starting the show.
Just the pleasure of speaking.
Art.
Yeah. It is a lost art, and we are not encountering live speakers in the same way that we might once have done. And and when you do hear someone speak really well live and in public, it feels amazing. It really goes right through you.
It does. Exactly.
I'd never thought of a podcast like that. That's so interesting.
Yeah. And what's funny is it took me years to start thinking about, it probably wasn't until 3 or 4 years into it that I really started to see the connections and seeing I'm using basically the same art form to do a different thing. And there's so much complex stuff around that because it touches religion. But I'm not religious. And so to me, there's maybe too many things. We could talk about it, but I don't want to just take it that direction. But it wasn't until way later that I started realizing, oh, this is what this is. And then I was really surprised and delighted by hearing Ira Glass on one of Mike Birbiglia's show talk about the same thing, because Mike Birbiglia was like, you kind of invented this storytelling thing of telling a story and then saying, this is what I think it means, and telling the story. And that's like This American Life. And then Ira Glass was like, no, that's what Jesus did. That's literally what he was doing. And so I do think it's just, I'm not trying to take all the mystical side of it out, but I do think it's a craft. It's an art form that
it is a craft.
I just love. Yeah.
And so how has that craft developed over time? What have you kind of developed like a muscle? What's kind of grown, but what have you very deliberately done as well? Like, what changes have you made to the craft? Yeah.
So I'm trying to think back. So I feel like, this is one of the ways that the show has maybe even changed, is that at the beginning, I was very much thinking about I wasn't thinking about in terms of, I already knew I was ADHD, but I wasn't thinking about this is for neurodivergent people. I was just thinking people that are creative or people that need to take a creative path.
Yeah.
I was thinking about that. And I was I was mainly thinking about, how do you build a life that is more suited to your creative nature? So I was thinking of that, but I would say at this point, I'm as interested in that or more interested in how art and storytelling and metaphor and analogy, all that stuff, helped me explain who I am and my story to people that I love. And so all of the things that I learned about story and analogy and all that craft element, the seeds of those were all the way back to when I was in college working at Subway. My parents made us have part-time jobs from high school and into college. And there's good and bad things about that, but I really hated it. It was so painful, so physically painful, mentally painful in a way that's hard to explain, literally just hard to explain, especially to my dad and my stepmom, who were longtime corporate people. They are 100% bought into this. And I remember one day my dad met me for lunch on my lunch break at Subway. And I don't even remember what I said, but I know I was using an analogy to explain why this hurts, why this is so hard. And he says to me, he said to me since, he's like, that was the first day that I got it. And I was like,
interesting. So he was open to it.
yeah, I mean, but I had to use art, storytelling, analogy. I had to use a craft to be understood. And so I think that, over time, I became more and more obsessed with understanding that. I also came in the back door of, I don't know, a lot of artists have a natural, I also had a natural kind of rejection of craft because I like the intuitive nature of creativity and I like the mysticism of it and all that. But it was part of my personal journey of deconstructing where I came from in my childhood and all that I got into Joseph Campbell and then Carl Jung and then storytelling books, but not through the lens of craft, just through the lens of trying to understand life.
Deepening that knowledge. Yeah.
And so then it kind of rolled on from there, but then later it became, I would take stories that I loved, especially like stories that people were doing on stage and stuff like that. And I would just isolate them. And then I would just listen to them over and over. And I would think about, where does this hit me?
Right.
Then I try to think about what is happening in that moment. How is it creating that? And I think you hear, I'm not saying, I'm not necessarily comparing myself to a stand-up comic. I really respect that art form in a way that I don't even want to compare myself to it. But I've heard them say similar things that
I
they
have
would do
too,
that.
Yeah.
And so I kind of stumbled into doing that, but that's kind of been, and then that took over my whole creative practice of now that's just what I chase is like, can I construct a story? And I think of it like an opposite of a joke. So instead of it being something that makes you laugh, like if you've done it, you have a punchline that makes you laugh. A story usually is going to make you feel, might make you well up, but it's also, it's going to hit this very particular chord. Anyway,
you're looking for that feeling. I think for me, like one of the things that unites truly creative people is that it's the learning that they're motivated by, and the outputs are almost incidental. Like you might learn a really interesting thing and you might make a podcast about it, you might illustrate it, you might write a story about it. In lots of ways that doesn't really matter. The core of it is this fascination with information, ideas, feelings, concepts. That's
in a way I'm
that's
trying
what
to
pulls you
like
through.
I also, it's like, it feels very much like the creative practice side of it is like the lab of like, I want to take those things that I'm learning about and I want to apply them, whether that's craft or whether that's just information. I want to pass it on and test it almost. And I think it has that symbiotic relationship with your curiosity, so I totally feel that.
It always fascinates me. And what's interesting as well is that when you, I don't know, do events for writers and people put their hand up and say, well, where do you get ideas from? Like, how do you do that? And my response is, like, if you're asking that question, you are not there, But
where do you get rid of ideas? That's the thing I'm trying to figure out.
How do I stop these damn things coming in?
It's very true. It's very true. And I think, the only time that wasn't true, because I'm sensitive to thinking about like, it doesn't, if you don't have those ideas, I don't think it means that this isn't for you, but just what you just said, which is you're maybe not there in that. I think I didn't recognize what my kind of ideas looked like for a long time.
That's a really big one, because actually we don't, or most of us don't grow up in households that say, oh, that's a creative idea. I can feel the chewiness of that. I get that.
Yes.
And I used to throw away a whole load of stuff that I thought was just nonsense that was going through my head. And the thing that changed me was learning to keep a notebook and to write everything down. Like I did a little course that said, write down everything. Don't discern between it. Just capture the whole lot and see what kind of persists over time.
Yeah.
And it was only then that I began to see that that I'd been having those thoughts all along. I just hadn't been paying them any attention. They were always there.
Yeah. And also those two threads from Mike Birbiglia's podcast have been on my head a lot. But this second thread is, I heard him talking about how it's so essential for him to be around comics because the funniest things are the things that are like, he didn't use this term, but they're like the water that fish are surrounded by. Yeah. It's the stuff where you're like, if you are writing all that stuff down and sharing it with people that have a similar sensibility or know your sensibility, they're able to be like, ooh, that's really good. And it's usually the things that are the most normal to you. And that's why you're not recognizing them. Does that make sense? Do you feel like that?
It does. Yeah. And and it does really help to talk to other creative people about them. There's something about that kind of mutual recognition. Like you don't make the same work, you don't have the same kind of ideas, but you do recognize the quality of a really good idea when it comes, even if it's nothing to do with your work. And you're like, tell me more about that. I can feel that in someone else, that level of fascination that's really crucial to good work.
Yeah. And did you, when you were writing down, or even when you were putting books out, did you feel like, were there elements about what you were sharing that people responded to that you maybe undervalued?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm going to ask the questions, by the way, but let's just be clear here, but I'm going to answer that one. But yeah, I think my learning process was that actually and this is everyone's learning process. I could tell as I'm about to say it, but people don't care about me being smart. They don't want my clever ideas, my clever. Oh, this is the really, complex thing. I thought they love the bits that come from the heart, and they're often the simplest bits of the work. And they're often the bits that flowed out almost by accident, That's so true. They're almost incidental, but that's the water you saw in. That's exactly what you're saying, I think. That's so,
oh man,
do you find the same?
So, I do. And I also think, I don't want to make it a gender thing because it's not. But I do think in America, in the creative field, in the overly conventional masculine sectors, there's such a premium on cleverness. Yeah. There's such a premium on the cerebral that I think I have to remind myself of that all the time because it's so easy to want to do a creative thing that there's, I'm not going to call out anybody, but when you think about like comedians, the comedians that get the most praise critically are usually the most clever, but rarely the funniest.
But you're not laughing.
You're not laughing. You're like, that's good. That's undeniably good because it's clever.
That's right.
So I think I'm glad you said that because it's something that I need to think a lot about. I need to remember that all the time.
It's so hard to, I'm just in the death throes of writing a book at the moment. And
well, thank you for doing this. This is an escape.
Yes, an escape. Thank you for distracting me. Yeah. But I need that reminder all the time. Like, stop trying to be smart. Stop getting up in your head. Just write the thing. I used to say this to my students, and I can't believe that I've not absorbed it yet. Like, say the thing that you want to say really directly. Ignore all this stuff about show, don't tell, because I actually think that's become a problem. I think everyone's trying to show so much that they'll talk about anything except the thing. And it's like, start by writing down the thing. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't use words you wouldn't use if you were saying them out loud. Don't try to conceal it so that you can reveal it later. Like, say the thing. That's the craft. Really that's the craft.
Most of the time, things that are great, you don't realize that they do. You don't even realize that they're doing it. And also, if you want to conceal it because you just can't help yourself, then you can do that after you know what it is.
That's right.
Then you really can. Then you can really do something good.
Yeah.
Because you actually
need to
know.
Look it in the eye.
Yeah. That's really great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so back to the podcast. Okay. I want to know about how your audience built, because how many people listened to podcast number 1? How many people listen now, and what happened in between? I need some coaching here, actually. I'm a bit stalled.
Yeah. So there's a couple different things. So I think that, and I'm really, because I do this show about building a creative practice.
Yeah.
And I think this is also just something, I don't know. I think it's part of there's something about my upbringing, which was not a creative culture, but it was a very analytical culture. And we always wanted to know why something was good. We always wanted to talk about that. If we watched, I remember in 1999 walking out of the Matrix, me and my dad and my brother, and we're like, why? What is that? What's
What
happening?
happened?
Yes, what happened in there? Geeking out about this. And so I think that I'm almost, even though I know there's a part of the best creative work, usually there's a part of it that you can't explain. There's a part of it that's kind of random, or it's like by chance that this one's better than the one you did the day before. There's an element of that for sure. But I really love, when I do something I really like, I really want to know how I did it. I want to try to know. The whole time I'm building the podcast, I'm thinking about what's working, what's not working, so that I can talk about it on the show and so I can do it on purpose. I think that one of the things was early on, it's much more about endorsements. So it was much more about like people, Seth Godin talks about it like people like us do things like this. So designers and illustrators, when there were a couple people that were like leaders in that world said, hey, I like this. Then that group of people were like, oh, people like us do things like this. Like, okay, that's fine. Okay, I can listen to that. Yeah. So that was the first thing. I think that the other thing was like, for the longest time, it was just a monologue podcast. The thing about that, that works is it's really difficult. There's a ton of stuff that doesn't work about it. But one of the things that works is that it's easy to be consistent in terms of what people get from the show. Whereas when you have guests, it's way more unpredictable. And there are ways to kind of plan around that, but it is just a factor. When you have a mostly interview show, people are going to interact with it much more on an a la carte basis.
Right.
And so even the interviews, I tried to bake in some of the things that I thought made the monologue episodes good. So that was interesting. So that when people turned it on, I can't remember who said this, but when people go consume a piece of art or they want to go reach for something, they're usually reaching for what they get from it.
Right.
On a psychological level. And so I was thinking a lot about like, what am I trying to deliver on this show? What feeling? What do they get from this? So that when they're hungry for that, they know to go to that. Like, oh yeah, I get that every time from Creative Pep Talks.
What is this for?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so they know. So when that hunger comes up, they're like, oh, I want that. That's the thing I want. And then I think ultimately, then a big thing that I used to focus a lot on is the best way to say it. I would talk to someone at Wondery at some point, and she was a CEO. I think she was CEO of Wondery, but she just said audio feeds audio, and it was just this idea that if you want people to listen to your show, you have to be on other shows, like getting them from Instagram or TikTok or wherever. It's just too many leaps. And I think
such a big insight that's taken me a long time to get to.
It's too many leaps because part of the reason is because that hunger thing is that when they go to Instagram, they're looking for something that podcasts don't give them.
Yeah.
So, it's just really tricky. Whereas if you give them something that they're really hungry for on a different show that they already listened to, and they're like, oh, I want that, then they're likely to go to you. That was probably the biggest thing.
It's the best advice. It's taken me a long time to realize that, not necessarily in terms of podcasting, but I was like trying to, use my Instagram to get people onto my Substack or to buy a book. Right. They don't want to do that. They're on Instagram because they want Instagram-y content for them to consume on Instagram. Yeah. And actually when you think about it, it's so inhospitable to be trying to move people along all the time. Yeah. Yes. It's not friendly. It's just advertising all the time.
It is. And I always thought about it like, I grew up in the Midwest, and when you would go to the mall in the food court, they would be giving away free samples.
Yeah.
And I was always like, there's a reason why they're giving free samples in the food court and not in JCPenney. Because if they're in JCPenney and here's a piece of chicken, you're like, who are you? What? No.
Why are you giving me chicken?
Yes, I don't want that. I'm not in the food court. And when I'm hungry, I'm going to go to the food court. And so I think a lot about that. And same reason why this is just a random theory that I have no business saying this.
Yeah.
I can just say it. I don't have any business saying it. But I will say, just for the hell of it,
That's
I
what
will
we're
say
here for.
that I think that it's one of the things, like, I have friends that are musicians, and I'm always like, if I were you, I would just use Spotify as your social media. Don't think about it as your discography. It's already going to be a mess. It's already a mess.
Yeah.
But when people go to Spotify, they are looking for music.
That's so wise.
You know? And so you don't have to be a comedian on TikTok.
Yeah.
And if you are, the chances that they're going to leap from that to wanting to hear your music are so, like, it's just impossible.
It's so funny, isn't it? And we're all in all these different places. And I think we can find it so hard to respect the place. You know, when you're making a podcast, you are making it for podcast lovers.
Yes.
And you're not there to convert people to being a podcast lover.
Right. No.
You're there to find existing podcast lovers who like the specific stuff you're talking about. Like, I'm never going to convince, people that listen to a gardening podcast to listen to my conversation with someone that's written a book. Like, that's not, they might also like that, but they won't come because they're gardening,
Yeah, absolutely.
It's so simple, and it's always the simple insights that end up getting you the place that you need to go every time.
And I think, I do think, I feel like anytime I open this door in my head, it gets a little bit like my brain is like malfunctioning, because it's like, your brain doesn't want to think like this. So I do it carefully, but I do think all of these things can have a relationship. I just think that I think understanding what the relationship is helpful. Just realize, like, Instagram is where, and it always changes where these things happen, but Instagram is where they're like discovering you and trying to figure out whether they like you at all.
Yeah.
And then there are people that I've discovered on Instagram, and I knew them on Instagram for 2 years. Mm. And then eventually I was like, I really like this person. I want to go listen to their podcast. And then it's just a really slow process. And a podcast is a great place to go deep with somebody.
Yeah.
And that's also helped me with podcasting too, is one of the reasons I think I've stayed in it long term is it doesn't have organic reach. It doesn't go viral. It is literally for people that want to go deeper with you.
Yeah.
That's where they do it. And so it's a really long game thing, I do think people, I don't know if you do this on your podcast, because I've listened to some of your interviews and they're great. But do you do any solo episodes?
No, I don't. And in fact, this could turn into coaching.
I think you should do solo episodes.
Ooh, you're about the 5th person this week that's told me that. So I'm beginning to hear it. My podcast has been on hiatus because I began to just not enjoy it. Right. But I love podcasting and I love podcasts. So I know I want to be making a podcast. Yeah. But I needed to do my long, slow thought process that I go into.
I get that. 100%.
I needed a couple of years to just think, right, like, yeah, I still definitely want to do this. And I've been thinking more about how I can produce a format that's a bit more consistent and a bit more fun. But what I'm hearing very strongly is people like to hear me talking to them, which is, I don't know about you, but my assumption is always like the other people are the interesting ones. And I'm like the neutral conduit in which this is happening.
Yes.
But of course, you have to, at some point along the line in this career, accept that people are there because they like your work.
Yeah.
And did you find that hard to believe? I've found that really hard.
Like I said, in my 20s, not as much. I'm being honest, not as much. I don't know why it was. I'm not really sure what that is. But as I went along, I hit a wall about halfway through. I was like, I don't want to hear myself talk anymore. I hate that. Why? Why would I do this? And so I hit it later. I'm not like, we'd have to go full therapy to figure out why that was, but
we haven't got time for that, but that's okay. That's okay. We can,
but yeah,
you can do that over the next 10 years and just gradually unravel the storytelling.
yeah. So I don't know, but eventually, I did get that way. But I think, what was really hard about podcasting for a long time is that it didn't exist before. So it doesn't have, when you have a TV show, when you watch a TV show that should have been a movie, you just know. You're just like, this is the wrong format for this. And so I think I had a really hard time figuring out, like, what is it, especially the solo thing, because especially at the time, very few people were doing it. So I didn't know, like, I was trying to figure out, how do you do this? And one of the big shifts that helped was realizing, like, okay, there are books and audiobooks. This is like an audio blog. That's all it is. It's an audio blog. And that really changed the way that I thought about it. Because it was the right level of casual, because if they want something pristine, they will go to a book. An audiobook.
Yeah.
That was really useful for me to think about.
That's really interesting. So what's your approach to those episodes? Do you bullet point what you're going to talk about, or do you just sit down and flow?
I went through, I think I'm always like tweaking it. But really early on, it was just like, I have an idea, I'm going to go talk about it. And then it pretty quickly turned into like outlines and bullet points. Then the more I got obsessed with like the craft of storytelling, the more written things became. But I never just read it, but there were times where it was fully written, if that makes sense. So it's fully written, it's there. I think that I feel more comfortable with, if I wrote this and I meant it when I wrote it, I am comfortable trying to get back into that headspace so that I'm able to perform it. So it's not inauthentic, because it is something I mean, but I am, I heard an actor say, I think it was not on a podcast or something. I heard Surrey and McKellen say something like, they're not pretending to feel emotions, they're feeling motions on command. And that's, so I think that's what I try to do now, is like, okay, I planned it, I wrote it, but I want it to feel like I am saying it now. So I have to get there. I have to leave some room. And maybe I'm just making it too complicated. It's a lot of stuff to think about making an audio blog, but that is how I think about it.
No, that does make sense. But I think what you're also talking about really is freshness. That you don't ever want it to be a monologue that you're reading out. You want that spontaneity to come in, and that authenticity, and that, and it is then a creative process when you're speaking. It's not just you, because my guess is that you'd be very bored by repetition. Yes,
very, very bored. And it also speaks to the fact that that is what people want from a podcast. So again, the form with a book, if you're reading a book and you're thinking, wow, this is really fresh off the presses, but not really well thought out, you're like, that's not a book. This is a, whereas on a podcast, if you're like, okay, this is tight, but it's too tight. This isn't a podcast.
I always love to see people in process.
Yeah.
Let's talk about neurodivergence.
Sure.
Because actually, that's, you and I, I'm autistic.
Yeah.
When did you know you had ADHD? You said you knew before you started the podcast.
Yeah. So when I first started talking to my doctor about it was like my mid-20s.
So you went to your doctor, did you? That was
I went to my doctor, and then eventually I went to a psychologist and did a more kind of rigorous testing, and found out a lot more about the particulars of my flavor of it.
Special flavor.
And what's going on there. Turns out I've got all of it. I've got all types of ADHD, and I've got double the memory deficit required for being. So I got the whole kit and caboodle. And what's really funny is when I've talked about it on stage or in the show. I had a joke about, when I was in kindergarten, I had a friend who I thought he was awesome. I was like, this is the only guy that's up to speed. Like, I like this guy. And then he had to go get medicine at the office one time. And I was like,
wait,
are you sick, man? Like, what's up? And he's like, no, I'm just hyper. And I was like, I thought that was just like being awesome. Like, that's what I thought. You have to medicate this? And so that was one thing. And then, but the joke was, and then in high school, I was recreationally doing Adderall one time with my friend Brian, but we had a pill and we both went away and did it. And the joke is that we both did wild things at night. Like, he stayed up to the crack of dawn, like was trembling watching the sunrise. And I did something way crazier than that, which was my homework in an efficient manner. I was like, whoa, what is going on?
Wow, this really works.
And I thought, but I can't talk to my parents about it. Cause I'm like, so I was doing some recreational drugs. Turns out I'd like more of it, So I didn't know what, and also I just grew up in the Midwest, and especially at a time where it wasn't well understood at all. And I didn't know what to think of it. But the funny thing about that joke is that that's a joke I wrote for talks and stuff. Then later I've heard two other neurodivergent people, two ADHD comics with almost the exact same joke, because that's just the experience. It's just an experience of what that feels like when you have, and I actually don't take medication for it, but now, that was one of the first, and I always knew I'm not like everybody else. I was definitely aware of that. But it wasn't, but I also like repressed thinking about it until I couldn't anymore.
Well, it's a painful thought when you're younger, isn't it? I think that feeling of being outside of the norm, you've talked quite a lot about masking and that experience of trying to be the thing that you're supposed to be, but then that quickly becomes a multiplicity of things, because it turns out that lots of people are lots of different things, and so you end up being able to fake all of that. You can be the party guy, and you can be the studious, all of those things become just different masks. But the fear behind that is like, what would I be if I wasn't acting? What would I be?
Yeah, very true. Very true. And also, and to me, I had another component of, and my listeners are familiar with this story, of knowing that whatever I was like my mom. And that when I was really little, that was a great thing. But then as I got older, it just felt like a curse, because I'd watched her life be riddled with addiction and abusive relationships and multiple families and all this stuff. And so I also didn't want to look at it, because I thought, I didn't think it was subconscious. I just thought I'm trying to not be this. This is what I'm trying to not be. I don't want a doctor to be like, there actually is no not being this. This is just,
this is what you are
in your DNA. So
Yeah.
I think that's what was going on there.
Well, and of course, one thing we know is that neurodivergent people are great self-medicators. And it's so interesting that we've had that wrong for ages. Like, we've thought that particularly autistic people are like the boring ones. They're staying at home. They're definitely not out doing drugs. But actually, as we've looked into it, like, I was a huge drinker as a teenager, like massive self-medicator, because it was the only way I could get myself into those spaces. Like, I had to be numb. But there's also that attempt to stabilize your weird emotions that feel so out of whack with what everyone else is doing. And when I think through my autistic and ADHD friends, I'm thinking about one of them has a Valium addiction, loads of alcoholics, like kind of quite fascinating recreational drug users, like the kind of friends that were like, oh, so I took some acid and then I took a tranquilizer and then I smoked a joint and then I did this, and they're like sort of calibrating their feelings across the night. That now I see as a hallmark of being neurodivergent, rather than a deviation from that geeky image that we're supposed to have.
I've heard, from just anecdotally, friends that I have that are autistic, almost all of them have a relationship to alcohol in particular that was
because it's so available.
so available, and did something, the regulating and the social component and all that. I wonder, as you say it now, like, it just makes me think, it feels like just trying to do something to you to get more towards the middle of what you're supposed to be feeling, what you're supposed to be experiencing.
Well, you're just trying to feel okay.
Yeah.
But at the same time, being a drinker at a certain age makes you cool. And so
true.
actually you're trying to get towards two centers at once. And
very true. Yeah.
Then you're quite difficult to deal with because you're drunk. Like, it doesn't actually work out, but like that, it takes you a while to learn that, I think.
It does. It definitely does. I think feel like it's sad too. It's not, I'm not like,
it is sad. I mean, I'm laughing about it, but it's gallows humor, because actually I think, as I think through the people in my life who are like me, they've often had huge struggles with this, and like, in a way that them turning to it was rational. It was the best decision they could make at the time, but also not healthy in the long term, and not okay.
100%. And that was a big part of my process. Why I talk so much about ADHD, and from what I gather from how you've talked about it, or how you think about autism, part of neurodivergence, which I didn't understand at first, this is why I gravitate towards it as a term, is me getting diagnosed with a disorder, funnily enough, is what became the birth of a positive self-psychology.
Yes.
And that embrace of your neurodivergence, that was the thing. That's what's hard, because I don't currently medicate for ADHD, but I've been so vocal about getting diagnosed. Sometimes I feel misunderstood, because some people take that as I'm telling people to go get medicine, which everybody has to do. They have to do their own journey and figure out their own thing.
Make your own decision, basically.
But my point of it was not that. My point was, finding this changed my self-image dramatically, from a negative image to a positive self-image and a positive self-psychology, because of things like that. Because I realized my mom, we don't have an official diagnosis, but you do get it from one of your parents. And my dad is like, a CPA in corporate America. And so she, her whole entire life was shamed for never being able to stop smoking. And the psychologist that diagnosed me told me, because I told him that I had smoked for 5 years and was obsessed. And I always said, if I had a genie, first wish, world peace. Second wish, cigarettes are good for you. I'm like, please, let me have it back. But he told me, he's like, nicotine is chemically almost identical to what we prescribe. So that stuff like that, as I got my diagnosis, made me realize, like, my mom isn't bad. She's trying to cope. She's trying to figure this out.
She can to cope.
And it totally changed. And that shift changed everything about how I thought about life and myself, and self-development and creativity and all that.
And how creativity is knitted into it. I mean, I always say that I spent my whole, because I wasn't diagnosed until I was 40, or I didn't identify till I was 40, because actually, to me, the diagnosis was like the least helpful bit. It was the self-identification.
Sure. Yeah.
I had, at the time, I had to tell my doctor what it was and why I fitted it, and why, as a woman, I might look different to what he had. So, actually, for me, I always say I identified. That's a side point, but
true. Yeah, that's totally true.
Yeah. But I, until that point, I saw myself as a broken neurotypical, and suddenly I could see myself as a very normal autistic person.
Yeah.
And also therefore meet my needs, like see them as reasonable. And that's the shift. It's not huge. I think I'm beginning to see stuff come through very strongly, that people feel very threatened by people with ADHD and autism saying, I need this, Sorry, that's the dog
That's all right.
barking.
Fine.
It's real life.
It's good. It's a podcast.
It's a podcast. That's
Yeah.
right. I love it. My debut on Being, my cat had to be let out of the room because she was meowing, and they left it in the podcast.
I love it. That's exactly what it should be.
It's really good. But yeah, so I found that I could just, it shouldn't feel threatening to people. It shouldn't feel like it's going to be a big demand, because actually the adjustments that most people want to make are so small. They're just saying, oh, wait, can I just choose where I eat my lunch, please? Because I can reset then. Can I take a walk rather than do this sitting down? Like they're so tiny. It's not saying, I need you to change everything. I need to be treated like a queen. It's like, actually, can I just do my own thing for a while? Because I'll be a much better employee or friend or partner if I do. That's it. So simple.
Man, I love that. I love what you said. I love the word reasonable. It's so true. And I thought about a lot. Like I've tried to, when talking to my dad, like I said at the beginning, giving him the analogy to make it make sense of why this was so painful to me. One of the things really frustrating to me is at different times, when I would describe, like, here's why I can't sit in a chair for 8 hours. Here's why I can't do that.
Yeah.
And nothing hurts me more, really, when someone I love says, well, like it's a limited mindset. And I'm like, I'll tell you what happens. I've done it. I'll tell you what happens. I gain tons of weight. I get tons of bad habits. I do because I have to do the reasonable thing, which is turn this fire hydrant off in my body that's flipping out. And so
that just needs to move. It's just movement. It's not bad.
Yes.
It's neutral.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
neutral to need to move.
Like I do more. Unfortunately, I didn't know this was going to be true. But working for myself for the past however long, 10, 15 years, is so much more work than any other job I could have.
Oh my God, I know.
So, that's the bad news. The bad news, so much more work. The good news is I can do it however I want. I literally, half the stuff I write is in the bath. The other half is on a walk. I just do work in such a weird way, but that's how I have to do it.
Because I think one of the things about neurodivergent brains is we can't let go of the stuff that interests us. So I can't switch off my working brain, and I don't want to. I don't know how to. I never could.
Yeah.
What I don't want to do, because like you, I've never been able to hold down a proper job.
Yeah.
Is be told what to do and when and how. That's not okay for me. Yeah. So God, I'm running over your time so much. Okay. I'm so sorry.
We go over all the time.
I've got two big questions that I want to ask before I let you free. The first one is when did you start to bring this into your work, and why? Like what point did you think? Because I was listening to your Right Side Out series and thinking about how intentional that was about really leaning into that and saying, we're going to talk about this and we're going to talk about how to do it.
Yeah.
At what point did you think, right, this actually needs to come in, and and why?
It was early. I know it was early in the show where I started to, I think early on, I felt like I remember having to make a decision about whether I'm going to talk about being ADHD. Yeah. And, this being 9 years ago or something, 10 years ago, I think that I knew that I think it was such a huge deal for me. That
did you feel shame to admit it?
Yeah, I think I felt mostly afraid that it was going to have a negative impact on my career. That I was going to that people I knew. One of the reasons I want to talk about it, actually, honestly, it's funny because at the time, and looking back, this is not true, but at the time, we had some representation of autism in the culture. Now, looking back at that representation 10 or 15 years from now looks so ridiculous, and a lot of it's really bad, right? But at the time, I didn't know that. I didn't know enough about any of this stuff. But I felt like, okay, I'm watching people in the Midwest take this seriously with their kids, even if they're doing it really wrong. It's something they're thinking about, and there's a conversation about. People are making some concessions for those people. And then ADHD, I knew I'd watched my mom's life just be horrifying. I'd had so many friends that whose lives, like, a lot of my creative friends who either were neurodivergent in some way, some of those people didn't make it. Others, were just struggling the worst lives. Just, and so I really felt the decision to start talking about it on the show was purely about, I was hoping that we would have what we have right now, which is a huge conversation around it, because I thought, and I was no part of that happening. I just, that's why I was doing it, as I was like, I want people to know this is not funny. It is funny. It's funny.
It's funny, but it's not funny.
Yeah. It's funny and not funny. It is,
we
so
could be
much
part
more
of the
serious.
joke, and it's hilarious.
Yes.
But we shouldn't be the butt of a joke, because it's unkind, but also most of those jokes are based on complete nonsense anyway.
True. And misunderstanding it completely. I personally am just the type of person who, if I'm funny in real life with my kids or family, I'm happy to make fun of myself. I don't mind that. What I don't like is if someone really thinks you're a piece of shit and you're the butt of the joke, that's a whole other thing. So for me, it was like, I don't care if ADHD is a joke. There's so much funny things about it, as long as you also know that it's really, really serious and really makes it difficult to every day. Every day is difficult. That goes hand in hand with it.
And I would add to that, as long as you acknowledge that being a neurotypical is also quite funny objectively. Like a lot of the things that neurotypical people do are 100%. Hilarious to me. You know?
I mean, like, I think that...
Wait, you're going to all gather together in the noisiest space possible so you can't hear each other and all wear the same clothes. Like, what? Sorry. That's objectively funny to me.
I actually think such a huge percentage of stand-up comedy is literally just pointing out neurotypical culture. Just being like, look at this. What is happening here? But I think so. I think I wanted to start making work about it because I felt like I hoped that people would start to understand the severity of it, and that also then it would lead to maybe. I also, even before I had ever heard the term neurodivergence, I had one of my biggest core values that I knew was true. And this a little bit came from growing up in, the Bible Belt, whatever.
Yeah.
There were phrases like that were kind of weaponized against people that were different. So there were like scripture that talked about like every man's temptation is the same. And that would be extrapolated into an idea that we're all the same. Yeah. So, and it's a meritocracy thing. It's every person's basically the same. And so the results are due to your character. That's it. And so I had this huge value of, I know we're not the same. And I know it's one of the best things about being a human is that we're not the same. Yeah. I think that was why
Amazing.
I also didn't think anyone was going to listen. So I didn't, I thought, sure, maybe some clients will be like, should we hire him? I mean, like, it's a liability.
But has that reaction changed over time? Like, did you get any iffy responses at first? I mean, I know I sure did. And is that I feel like it is getting better, but there are some people that have got more angry about it.
Very true. Very true. And I think my favorite thing about, because as I started saying about the conversation is happening way more now. It is what part of like what I was hoping would happen for ADHD. And then now that I have a little bit better understanding of autism, I'm really happy that people are understanding that in a totally different way and have a more nuance and understanding around it. Okay. You asked, what is did this happen? Like bad reactions to it? Yeah. What I was going to say, my favorite thing is, because I think now that it's such a hot topic, you get the thing of, oh, everybody's ADHD now, everybody's autistic now.
Everyone's a little bit autistic.
Yes, like that thing. And it's a terrible, terrible thing. And one of my favorite things is, have you seen that graph on when being left-handed was normalized? What?
Oh, no, I've not seen it, but yeah.
It's really fascinating because what happens is we're in this period of the graph where coming out as these things is happening rapidly. And what it looks like when you're experiencing it is this on this line graph is a huge shot. We're like,
why is everyone left-handed?
Everybody's out. And then when you watch the left-handed thing, it has a massive plateau. Once it's normal to be whichever one, then it will course correct. It'll be, or won't course correct. It'll just be, it won't be as shocking and so skyrocketing.
I read in like quite a respectable book by someone with a PhD recently, the sentence, how come so many people are becoming autistic now? Surely it would have been noticed when they were children. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, here is the many ways that my autism was noticed when I was a child, but they didn't have the word for it. Yeah. So they had the word for it, but I'd have had to have been an 8-year-old white boy, and that would have a middle class preferably, because otherwise I'd have just been naughty. So like exclusively those people were diagnosed, and they didn't think that girls could be autistic at the time. So everything was seen and everything was felt. And it was only when the tool was available that you and I could say, this is what I am. This is what it is. And here are all these other people that are like me. And no, not everyone is like me. Sure. As otherwise it wouldn't have been so damn hard.
Yeah. And it's very bizarre because in retrospect, it's like, it's even sadder to me because I think all of these people, there's two parts that are really sad to me. One is all of these people, when you were in high school, you were looking around and being like, these people are weird. Like, why are they weird? So they're weird. Not to use a bad term for it, but you know it. You knew it then. So why is it surprising you? Like, oh, it turns out everyone's weird. Like, there's a lot of weird people out
weird,
there. And then, I don't remember. I was going to say something else, but that's just me. But I think that's a huge part of it is like, you were very aware that there was a lot of difference. Maybe before you had a term for it or an understanding of it, you could say it's your problem. And it's, the other sad thing.
Pull yourself together. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like, oh, they're weird because they chose to be or whatever it is. And it's easier to kind of put them down. But the other thing I found really sad was that when I started to build an illustration practice, and at first I was kind of part of like some trendy stuff and the economy was good and I was getting some jobs early on, and then it crashed in 2008. And I got hit a brick wall, and I say that in my lowest times, in my darkest hour, when I hit rock bottom for me was I started to read business books. That was like, turned to the darkest arts. Wow. I gotta figure this out.
That got bad. I'm so sorry. Really bad. So sorry, man.
Terrible. And so I started diving into that world. And at first I thought, okay, gosh, I have to read this shit and I don't want to do it. But the thing that ended up being really promising and really sad was all of the most unicorn business people. A lot of them are neurodivergent people. And I was like, these aren't rare people. That's the thing. If you knew how to find these people and train them, a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them, this wouldn't be so unusual. You could have whole parts of every company that is utilizing these very different types of brains And so, yeah, that's the other sad element of it.
It's getting better. I'm an optimist, but
me too.
Like we're a part of this. We're doing our best. Final question.
Yeah.
And that is, for someone listening now, thinking, like maybe they're a writer, maybe they're an illustrator, maybe they're a dancer, thinking, should I start a podcast? Does it do anything for your career, or is the answer instead start a podcast if you want a podcast? Don't worry about the rest of it.
I would. That's a good question to end on. I would say that. I mean, having a podcast can be incredibly valuable to your creative practice and your career, I think. To me, the first thing I would say is, just like what you said, I'm a really big believer in that the first step of the creative process is taste. So do you have a taste for it? If you don't do it, because you won't know how to do it. It's literally like vegetarians trying to cook steak. They could do it. They could do the steps and everything, but if they can't taste it, it's going to be really difficult to nail it. And so I think that would be my first thing. However, if you love podcasts, it can be extremely valuable. I think the only thing I would say is I learned to do projects and have a multi-layer strategy of what it meant to be successful. So now one of the reasons it's really valuable is because we have sponsors. So it, pays money. So that's good. That's great. That's obvious thing. I never thought that would happen. And it was, before that ever happened, it was super valuable. It changed my career. And the reason is because it goes back to that thing of, it's kind of obvious in a way, but it wasn't obvious to me. Like, there's almost no place where you can go this deep with somebody. Like, mainly because it's a thing that you can do while you're doing other things. And I love bundling. ADHD people love that, love doing, two things at once. Like, that's why I love podcasts. I was constantly listening to podcasts. And so it's a space where a podcast is the middle step between someone hearing about you and someone becoming a true fan of you. Yeah. It is where that happens. And so if you want to have a creative practice, that's maybe the most difficult part, the most essential part, and the one that most of us don't value, because it's not, I don't really know why it is. We put so much emphasis on the discovery. We put so much emphasis on the sale. We put almost none on the steps that get you there. Like, I don't know if it's the discovery.
They're the mysterious bit. Or
the discovery seems like easy, but it's not. It's also the hardest. Yeah. It feels like if I played my cards right, I could get 1 million people to find out about me today.
People can discover you, but they don't necessarily hear that discovery. It runs past their eyeballs or past their ears.
Very true.
And there's always, I don't know how true this is or how researched it is, but there's always this statistic that goes around in publishing, which is that someone needs to have a book recommended to them 3 times before they'll buy it. Yes. That rings true for me, actually. I think, it's got truthiness, let's say.
It does.
I'm not sure how accurate it is, though, but that's a similar thing.
Yeah, it is. And I think for me, that's, the people that you are a fan of their podcast, you got to think that is a deep relationship in comparison to everything else. Yeah. And that means that you can build a lifetime of a practice on that relationship. And so I think it's incredibly valuable. And I would when I would get really practical, I'd just say, I think about it like your true fan idea. Most people only have one true fan, and that funds their entire living. It's their employer. That's it. Like, the person that hired them, that's their one fan. Changed everything, right? And so when you start the podcast, I would just think about it like, how can you use this to get 10 true fans? So how can you get 10 clients off of this? And if you do that, it will be the most valuable thing that you do. And you don't have to think about how do I get thousands and thousands so that I can, directly monetize it. And then ultimately I'll say one other bit, which this is maybe the most important thing. And I'm sure you probably have this with writing. So it could happen with a lot of different ways, but the podcast dramatically changed me. So when I started the show and I didn't think anybody was going to hear it, and I was just kind of having fun, whatever, I wasn't really thinking much about that. But then eventually when I had friends and then people in the industry listen, and then just people that, I don't know, I just knew 100 people are listening, 500 people are listening, whatever. I started to realize like, oh, I really want to mean what I'm saying. I really want to, I want to know that what I'm saying, and it came with getting criticism.
Right.
I realized like if someone criticized me and the thing they criticized me was about something that was inauthentic, it was terrible. I couldn't bear it.
Really true. Yeah.
And if someone criticized me for something that I would go to the grave for, if somebody said, we're all the same, and that, then I would be like, don't listen to my show. No,
you're not my people. This is really
my people.
fine.
And I don't care. And that criticism just rolls off me because I'm like, I fundamentally build my life on the opposite of that. And so a couple of years in, I was having a lot of anxiety about the show. And I think it was just, getting little criticisms, whatever. And that completely changed me because I started thinking, I really want to believe the stuff that I'm saying, even if I'm wrong about it or change later, that's fine. When I do it, I want to have been sold out about what I'm saying. And the thing that did was that made me examine what I said in real life and who I said I was and how I thought about my identity. And it changed me. I changed how I moved through life because of that.
But I think that circles us back beautifully, because actually what that speaks to is the autonomy that you get when you make your own spaces and you create spaces out of love and respect and authenticity, and you bring your authentic self there, and there goes the fear, because you've made this place, and that's a place that other people want to come to.
Yeah.
Andy, thank you so much for letting me take over your podcast. That was so
fun.
cool. That was so cool.
It was so fun. And it really, you got me on a bunch of occasions. Like, I was really in my feelings for most of the show. So I really appreciate you taking the time and being so sensitive to the topic. And I just really appreciate it.
It's lovely. It's such an achievement. So congratulations. You make me want to be less of a quitter.
Yes. I'm a major quitter. So that's why I was like, I've done this. Like, it feels like I did something. Okay, I'm back. Thank you, Katherine May, for making time to do this. I just feel so honored. And this was just the perfect way to dive into this giant project that I've been working on for the past 10 years. I'm back to tell you the CTA for this week. So the CTA, the call to adventure, how to take this episode and do something with it in your own practice, I'm calling Channel Your Overflow. Okay. The question is, how do you make your creativity a discipline when being disciplined isn't exactly what creative people do? It feels almost at odds with each other. And my take on this is that you have to channel your overflow. And what that means is, when I look back at this 10-year project, 10 years plus and going strong, I think the reason this was possible, it wasn't always easy. Sometimes it was really easy. But the reason it was possible to show up for 10 years every single week on this is because this is something that I just do. If I wasn't recording these conversations, I would still be doing and having these conversations somewhere, whether that was in conversation with other people or just voice memos on my phone. Like, this is a thing that I do. I love to analyze the creative process, the creative journey, creative careers. I get very, very analytical about these kind of things, and I love to talk about them. And when I say channeling the overflow, I'm talking about the overflow of my everyday life. If the reason I need a podcast is because I have more hours and more to say than anyone wants to listen to in my everyday life. Like 10 years ago, making this show, it was such a good outlet. And we were talking about this. My wife and I have talked about this a bunch, like how grateful for this show we are, because we don't have I need this as much as anybody might need to listen to it. I don't know, or want to. I need it. And so this is a place to put that. And so it reminds me a little bit of what Jerry Seinfeld says. He says he's a joke chuck, like a woodchuck. He chucks jokes. His brain automatically wants to find a punchline, wants to see the funny thing and construct the funny thing. And his brain automatically does that. For me, I am automatically trying to find the problem, solve the problem, see what works. Why did it work? That's the way that I interact with everything. And proof of this is recently I just thought about how I would consider myself kind of a mega comedy nerd. And then I realized I don't watch a ton of comedy, almost none. I only watch a few comedy specials a year. I go to a couple comedy shows, maybe 3 or 4 comedy shows a year, depending on travel and stuff. But I listen to hundreds of podcasts of comedians talking about comedy. And I think it's maybe less about comedy and more that comedy is such a difficult path, and you have to be so good at your craft. You can't just intuit your way completely. You really have to know what you're doing. So those people don't just do what they do. They know how they do what they do. So they can talk about how they do what they do. And so I think for me, the reason I am drawn to comedy in some ways, other than I'm just a goofball, is that I just love how analytical that this community can be. And so for me, that tells me something about my high tolerance, my high output, my massive overflow of this kind of thing. And so what I would challenge you to do is to find your overflow. Where are the places in your everyday life where you are producing more, you're creating more, you're doing it on accident, you're doing it automatically? Like for me, throughout my everyday, there are just things that I think, oh, this is a little like nugget. This is an idea. This just seems true to me. And I'll put it in my phone. And I'd be doing that whether I had a podcast or not. And so what are the things that you just have an overabundance of and you need a bucket to put them in? That's what this podcast is for me. It's a bucket to put this stuff in. And that makes it very easy to then make it a discipline. And so that's my challenge to you. Find in your everyday, where do you have more than is necessary or more that you know what to do with? That kind of surplus is exactly what you want to build a creative practice on. So I'm going to leave you with that. I'm going to say just last things are the thank yous and the goodbyes for the episode. Again, thanks, Katherine May. Thank you to Sophie Miller, who is an editor of the show and co-producer, and has really supported me mentally, emotionally over this past 10 years. And I wouldn't have been able to do it without you. So thank you, Sophie, for all the support. I know it hasn't always been easy. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of troubleshooting. It's a lot of self-motivating to make something this long. And I couldn't have done it without you pep talking the pep talker every single week. Massive thanks to Connor Jones of Pending Beautiful for the audio editing and sound design. you have been a really consistent dude throughout a long period of making this show. And I love you, man. And I really appreciate your support in making this thing possible week in and week out. I'm just so grateful to all the listeners and to the people that have supported the show over the years through Patreon and now Substack. You guys were doing that before we had any other ways of funding this thing. And as funding from sponsors and stuff like that has come and gone, you have kept this thing afloat. And there's so many relationships and people I've met because of this show that I'm just so grateful for. And so thanks for listening. Thank you for sharing the show, reviewing the show, supporting the show. Thanks to Yoni Wolf and the band Y for the best theme music and soundtrack of any podcast, I have to say. Yeah, thanks for showing up. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll be back next week for more pep. But until then, stay pepped up.